I sat in that room, quiet as a shadow, while she leaned over in her glittering red dress and whispered with a smile that I would get nothing from my own son's 40 million. She thought I was invisible, forgotten, already pushed aside. But what she didn't know was that a single letter, sealed and waiting, was about to change everything. And when the lawyer put his papers down and laughed, her smile cracked like glass. Thank you for watching and sitting here with me. It means more than you know. And before I go on, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please leave it in the comments, because stories like mine travel far and wide, and I like to feel that connection. You see, when I sat in that office with diamonds flashing and whispers cutting at my dignity, I felt small for a moment, but not broken. I remembered every mile I had walked with worn shoes to feed my son, every stitch I had sewn late at night to keep him warm, and I knew that those sacrifices carried a truth deeper than her laughter could ever touch. They thought I was just an old woman to be brushed aside, but I carried a history in my bones, and that history was about to speak louder than her jewels and her smirk ever could. I was born in a small town where money was scarce and work was harder than the ground we walked on. And when my husband passed too soon, I had no choice but to carry the weight on my shoulders. I raised my son with my own 2 hands, sewing patches into his jeans so he could walk into school without shame, cooking scraps into meals so he never went hungry, walking miles under the hot sun just to bring him the lunch I could barely afford, and when he was sick, I held his head and prayed over him through the long nights. I never asked for thanks, never dreamed of riches. I only wanted to see him stand taller than the hardships that bent me down. And he did. He grew, strong and clever, and he worked his way into success that I could hardly imagine, buying tall buildings, signing papers I could not read, wearing Italian suits that gleamed in the light, and for a while I thought it was all worth it, that every drop of sweat, every callus on my hands, had built him into a man who would remember where he came from. But then something changed. Or maybe it was always there waiting, because as his world grew bigger, mine seemed to grow smaller, and the warmth I once saw in his eyes began to dim whenever she stood beside him. She carried herself like a queen, polished and sharp, and though she smiled with her lips, she never once smiled with her heart at me. I could feel her hand guiding him away, brushing off the roots that tied him back to me, whispering in his ear that the past was just a burden. And I told myself to be patient, that love would steady him, that he would see the difference between a mother's sacrifice and a stranger's ambition. But deep down, I knew a storm was brewing. The storm showed its first signs on the day of the accident, a day that carved a hollow into my chest that will never fully heal. And I can still see the way the phone trembled in my hands when the call came through, the voice on the other end flat and hurried as if speaking of a stranger, telling me that my son was gone. I sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the fading light, and all I could think of were the years I had carried him on my hip, the times I had wiped his tears, the nights I stayed awake so he could sleep, and now he was being spoken of in past tense as though the blood and breath we shared had been erased in a single cruel instant. The funeral came quickly, too quickly, and I walked behind the coffin with my heart cracking at every step, listening to her heels click sharply against the floor, as if she were walking a runway rather than following the man she once called her husband. She wore red, not black, a bold red that stung my eyes and drew whispers from those who dared to notice, and her diamonds flashed under the church lights like little daggers, each sparkle a reminder that she was already counting her fortune. I stayed silent, clutching my shawl close, though the air was heavy and hot, because silence was the only shield I had left. And yet in that silence I could hear her laughter echoing faintly in the corner when she thought no one was listening. I caught her whispering to her friends, her lips curling with satisfaction, saying words that burned into me so deep I can still feel them. She'll get nothing. Not a dime. That old widow is done. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, but I gripped the pew and forced myself to stand. Forced myself not to cry where she could see, because I would not give her that satisfaction. After the funeral, I watched her move about the house that once belonged to both of them, her hands already sweeping over the furniture as though she owned it. Her voice sharp with commands to people arranging her parties. Her laughter loud as she boasted about new plans, redecorating, shopping sprees, vacations to places I could not even pronounce. She carried herself as if the fortune was already written in her name, as if my presence meant nothing more than an inconvenience, and every time our eyes met she looked right through me, as though I were invisible, a ghost haunting her future. I wanted to speak, to remind her that the wealth she flaunted had roots in the soil of my sacrifices. But the words stayed lodged in my throat, swallowed by years of endurance, and I thought perhaps silence would speak louder than my trembling voice. It was then that I began to understand betrayal in its truest form, not from strangers or enemies, but from the family that should have been my shelter. It was not only her words that pierced me, it was the memory of all I had done, every sacrifice brushed aside like dust under her glittering heels, every memory erased by her ambition. The whispers of neighbors reached my ears too, some saying she had already boasted about selling properties, some saying she had been seen with papers and signatures, ready to move forward, as though the man lying beneath fresh earth had been nothing more than a stepping stone. I carried these whispers inside me like stones in my pockets, heavy and suffocating, and I began to wonder if I had been a fool all along, if my love had been nothing but fuel for others to burn when it suited them. Still I remained calm, outwardly steady, though my heart felt like shattered glass. I told myself there's power in patience, that truth, though buried, finds its way to the surface, and I clung to that hope like a lifeline. Each night I would sit alone, hands folded tightly together, remembering my son's face when he was small, his eyes wide with dreams, his laughter pure before greed ever touched him. And I prayed that somewhere within the walls of this betrayal there remained a trace of the boy I once held. That was the thought that kept me breathing, the thought that gave me strength to endure her cruelty, because deep inside I knew something she did not. My son had never completely forgotten me, and the day would come when her arrogance would meet a truth far greater than her greed. As the days passed after the funeral, the weight of her words grew heavier, and I began to notice just how far the betrayal reached. It wasn't only the laughter at my expense, or the red dress that still haunted my eyes, it was the way she moved through every corner of my son's world as though she had built it with her own hands, erasing me piece by piece. I watched her throw out the old photo frames where his childhood smile lived, replacing them with portraits of herself draped in jewels, as though the years before she came into his life had no meaning at all. I wanted to scream, to gather those pictures and press them to my chest, but instead I stayed silent, letting her believe her victory was already sealed. I remembered the way she had leaned close to her friends at the funeral, whispering that I would leave with nothing, and I realized in that moment that she was not simply cruel. She was confident. She was certain that my son had left everything in her hands, certain that I had been cut out of the story of his success, certain that I was nothing more than a shadow in a corner she could sweep away. That certainty burned because it made me question what I knew of my own son, whether the boy I raised, the boy who clung to me when he was sick and called me his anchor, could have truly let me fade into nothing when it came to the life he built. It hurt in ways I cannot fully describe, as if the love I had poured over decades had been poured into dry ground, leaving no trace, no gratitude, no remembrance. There were moments I would sit alone at night, my hands trembling in my lap, wondering if perhaps she was right, if perhaps he had forgotten, if perhaps the shine of wealth had blinded him to the roots that had held him steady. I thought of the times he had taken me to those tall buildings he bought, proudly showing me the marble floors, the glass windows that reached the sky, telling me it was all possible because of the discipline I had taught him. And I asked myself, could a man who once spoke those words have truly turned away and left me with nothing? The doubt was sharp, cutting through my heart like a knife. And it was in those hours of doubt that I felt the depth of betrayal most deeply. Because it was not just her cruelty that haunted me. It was the possibility that my own flesh and blood had been persuaded to forget me. Still, even as that fear twisted inside me. Another voice rose quietly, reminding me of the little things my son had done, the small gestures of love that never made headlines but lived in memory. I remembered the way he still brought me flowers on my birthday, even after he became a man of business. The way he would sit with me in silence and drink tea whenever he visited, as though those quiet moments still mattered. And holding on to those memories gave me a fragile hope, a belief that maybe he had not been fully swallowed by her greed. That maybe, just maybe, there was something she did not know, something she would never see coming. It was in that space between pain and hope that I began to understand. The story was not finished, the will had yet to be read, and though she laughed and strutted with the arrogance of victory, I could feel in my bones that the truth was waiting, sealed in silence, ready to rise when the time was right. In the middle of my doubts, when I feared that my sacrifices had been forgotten, and my son's memory might have been twisted beyond recognition, I found an unexpected comfort in the steady presence of his lawyer. He was a man who had walked beside my son through years of business deals and endless contracts, and though I had not spoken to him often, I noticed the way he looked at me at the funeral. Not with pity, but with a quiet respect, as though he knew something the others did not. Days later, when the noise of her laughter still echoed through the halls, and her plans for the future grew louder with each passing hour, I felt a gentle hand on my shoulder, and it was his voice, low and firm, telling me not to lose heart. He leaned closer and whispered that my son had been a man of precision, careful with every detail, and that I should remember that careful men do not simply forget the roots that made them. I studied his face, searching for some hint, and though he spoke little, the weight in his words gave me strength. For the first time since the accident, I felt a glimmer of certainty that maybe my son had left behind more than the glittering fortune she bragged about, that perhaps he had left behind a truth that could not be erased by diamonds or arrogance. That quiet assurance became my anchor, and though he offered no clear answers, the steadiness of his presence told me that I was not entirely alone in this fight. It was as though my son, even in his absence, had chosen this man to carry a piece of his voice, a piece of his intention, and deliver it when the moment was right. From then on, I walked differently. I still heard her cruel whispers, still felt her mocking gaze whenever she caught sight of me, but I no longer carried the same fear in my chest. I held my silence not because I was powerless, but because silence itself had become a shield, a promise that time would bring a revelation. Each night as I sat in my small room, I pressed my hands together and whispered to myself that truth is patient, that justice does not always arrive with noise, but sometimes with a quiet step that shakes the ground more than thunder. I clung to that thought, and it was enough to help me rise in the morning, to endure her smirks, to prepare myself for the day when her certainty would crumble, and the respect that had been buried would finally return to me. The day came when I knew I could no longer sit quietly in the shadows. The invitation to the will reading arrived, and though her friends giggled as if it were already a celebration of her triumph, I understood that this was the moment everything would be revealed. My hands trembled as I folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope, not because I feared her, but because I felt the weight of years pressing against me, the years of sacrifice, the years of being invisible, the years of love that seemed forgotten. I stood before the mirror, smoothing the lines in my dress, not fine silk or glittering fabric like hers, but something clean, modest, and dignified. And for the first time in a long time, I saw in my reflection not a defeated widow, but a mother who had endured storms greater than greed. When I entered the office that morning, her perfume was the first thing that reached me, sweet but sharp, filling the air with her presence before she even spoke. She sat with her chin raised, her diamonds catching the light, her lips painted with the same red she wore to the funeral, as though she wanted the world to know she had already won. She glanced at me, then turned away as if the sight of me was no more than an interruption in her victory. But I walked to my chair slowly, with a straight back and steady steps, because I wanted her to see that I had not been crushed, that I had not been erased. I held my handbag close, not because it carried wealth, but because it carried my strength, the quiet strength that had carried me through hunger, loss, and loneliness. The lawyer looked at me as I sat down, his eyes meeting mine for only a second. But in that second, I felt something pass between us. A silent confirmation that gave me the courage to sit in that room where I was treated as an afterthought. She leaned toward me before the papers were opened, her voice soft enough that only I could hear, and she said with a smile, "This will be quick. You may as well prepare yourself to leave with nothing." I felt the sting of her words, but I said nothing, for I had learned that not every battle needs to be fought with the tongue. Sometimes silence carries more power than anger ever could, and as I sat back, my hands folded in my lap, I felt the calm of knowing that truth does not need to shout to be heard. That morning was a turning point, not because I raised my voice, not because I demanded my place, but because I walked into that room with dignity that she could not touch. I realized then that whatever came next, whether the will brought me fortune or nothing at all, I still carried something she could never own, the unshakable bond of a mother's love and the strength of a woman who had given everything without asking for a single coin in return. The room grew still when the lawyer cleared his throat, his fingers sliding across the neat stack of papers, and though I could hear the sound of her bracelets clinking as she shifted in her seat, the silence that followed seemed to weigh heavier than stone. I sat with my hands folded, my eyes lowered, but every sense alive, listening to the rhythm of his voice as he began to speak. She leaned back in her chair, smiling broadly as though she had written the words herself, her confidence filling the air so thickly it nearly smothered me. She interrupted once, her laugh sharp as she said, "Please, just skip ahead. We all know where this is going." And a few of her friends tittered beside her. But the lawyer's eyes did not waver, and his voice did not bend. He read slowly, each word measured, each sentence deliberate, and though her patience was thinning, I felt my strength grow with every passing second, because I knew the truth hidden in those pages was greater than the performance she put on for the room. She whispered toward me, her tone dripping with mockery. "Maybe you'll get a chair or a clock, something to remember him by." And I kept my gaze steady, refusing to answer, because I understood that responding to cruelty only feeds it. Instead, I thought of the nights I had stayed awake when my son was a child, nursing him through fevers, holding his hand through storms, praying that he would one day stand tall in a world that often tried to cut us down. Those memories wrapped around me like armor, protecting me from her taunts, and I sat quietly, knowing patience is not weakness, it is the calm before revelation. The lawyer continued, his voice carrying a weight she did not yet understand, and though she kept smiling, I saw a flicker in her eyes, a brief shadow crossing her face as if she sensed something she could not control. It was only for a heartbeat, quickly hidden behind another smug grin, but it was enough for me to know that arrogance often masks fear. I let the silence between us stretch, and in that silence I could almost hear the sound of her certainty beginning to crack, like glass under pressure, waiting for the one final blow that would shatter it completely. Her arrogance swelled with every pause the lawyer made, as though she believed even the silence bowed in her favor, and she tapped her nails against the polished wood, each click like a drumbeat of triumph she had already claimed. I watched her lean forward, her diamonds catching the light, her lips curling into a smirk as she said, "Let's not waste time. Everyone knows where the fortune belongs." Her voice dripping with pride so thick it made the air heavy. She thought her laughter was power. She thought her words sealed the future. But all I could see was a woman so blinded by greed that she could not hear the faint tremor in the lawyer's voice, the subtle shift in his eyes as he held back a truth too large to be rushed. I sat still, my body quiet, but my mind alive, remembering the years when my son trusted me with every secret, when he told me in whispers that he would never forget where he came from, when he looked at me with the certainty of a boy who knew his mother's sacrifices had built his world. Those memories became my strength, and I let them flow through me as she laughed, because I knew what she did not. That arrogance often speaks too loudly, just before it falls silent. The lawyer's hands moved carefully over the papers, his pause deliberate, and while she rolled her eyes and whispered again to her friends, I saw the faintest smile play at the corner of his lips. It was a smile not of amusement, but of knowledge. The kind of smile that carries the weight of what is about to come, and in that moment my heart steadied. She did not notice it, too consumed with her own performance, too certain of her victory to sense that the ground beneath her was already beginning to shift. I kept my silence, not because I was weak, but because I understood that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that waits, listening, knowing that truth is patient and it does not stumble when arrogance demands haste. The lawyer finally set the papers down, his fingers resting on the edges as though he carried something too delicate to be rushed. And then he did something no one in that room expected. He laughed. It was not the laugh of a man amused, nor the laugh of someone careless. It was the quiet, knowing laugh of truth, rising to the surface after being buried too long. Every head turned toward him, and in that instant the diamonds on her neck seemed to lose their shine. Her smile froze halfway across her face, and her confidence cracked so quickly I could almost hear it. My heart pounded in my chest, not with fear, but with the strange calm that comes when you realize patience has finally met its reward. He reached for a sealed envelope, one that had been tucked away beneath the formal documents, and when he opened it, the handwriting inside was unmistakable. The strong and uneven strokes of my son. My breath caught because even after death his hand reached out across time to speak, to protect, to remind the world that he had not forgotten the woman who carried him through darkness. The lawyer began to read, and his voice filled the room with words that cut sharper than any jewel, words written by my son himself, declaring that if anything were ever to happen to him, the entirety of what he had built would belong to the one who believed in him before anyone else, his mother. The silence that followed was heavy, and I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me. But I did not move. I did not gloat. I simply sat in my chair with my hands folded, the weight of my son's love pressing against my heart stronger than the weight of any fortune. She tried to speak, her voice stuttering as she began to argue. But the lawyer silenced her with a single raised hand, explaining that the letter had been verified, signed, and witnessed with every legal measure taken. Her mouth opened again, but no words could cover the truth that now lay bare before everyone. For the first time since the funeral, I saw her mask fall, her arrogance crumble, and her eyes widen in disbelief. And in that moment I understood that greed can blind, but truth has a way of opening eyes with a light that cannot be dimmed. Her face drained of color as the lawyer's words settled into the room, and for the first time her laughter was gone, replaced by a silence so sharp it cut through every corner of that office. She tried to gather herself, to fix her expression into something composed, but the cracks were too deep. Her arrogance had shattered, and the eyes of her own friends turned away in discomfort. She stammered, reaching for excuses, her voice breaking as she said, "The letter must be a trick, that it could not possibly be real." But the lawyer only adjusted his glasses and spoke with the calm certainty of a man who knew every line, every signature, every witness had been placed with care. I sat still, my hands resting on my lap, and though my heart was beating so loud, I thought they might hear it. I did not move, I did not speak, because silence at that moment was the loudest voice I could carry. She pushed back in her chair, her jewels clattering against the table as she tried to protest again, claiming she would challenge the will, that she would take it to court. But the lawyer explained in patient tones that no court could undo what was sealed with such clarity. Her anger rose, her voice sharp, trembling with desperation, as she realized her certainty had turned into dust before her eyes. The people who once nodded along with her sat frozen, no longer sure if they should defend her, and for the first time she was truly alone in her performance, her spotlight gone, her script torn apart by the truth. I looked at her then, not with triumph, not with cruelty, but with a quiet strength that comes from endurance, because I understood something she never would. Money can be spent, diamonds can lose their shine, power can vanish in a single breath, but the respect of a son who remembers his mother's love, that cannot be stolen, and it cannot be faked. I felt no need to rise, no need to strike her with words, for her own greed had done the work for me, leaving her exposed in a way that no anger of mine ever could. In that silence, in that heavy stillness, I felt the years of pain settle, not as a wound, but as a reminder that dignity does not roar. It simply waits until the truth reveals itself. As the room slowly absorbed the weight of what had just been revealed, I sat there in stillness, letting the truth speak louder than anything I could ever say. And in that moment, I felt the presence of my son, more than I had since the day he left this world. It was as if his hand reached across time, resting gently on my shoulder, reminding me that the years I spent mending his clothes, the nights I stayed awake by his bedside, the countless sacrifices I made in silence, none of it had been forgotten. I could see her trembling now, her lips pressed tight together, her fingers twisting the very rings she once flaunted with pride. And I realized that what broke her was not just the loss of money, but the realization that she had never truly owned him, that she had only borrowed the light of his success while I had given him the roots to grow it. I thought of all the times I had doubted myself, all the nights I had wondered if love had been wasted, if memory had been erased, and with every breath I felt those doubts dissolve like mist in the sun. My son had not abandoned me, he had not chosen greed over loyalty, he had remembered, and in remembering he had lifted me out of the shadows where she tried to keep me. That truth filled me with a strength no amount of fortune could equal. And though my eyes burned with tears, I held them steady, because those tears were no longer born of sorrow, but of gratitude. Gratitude that the love between a mother and her child cannot be buried, not by death, not by lies, not even by the cruelty of another. The lawyer closed the folder gently, his task finished, and the silence in that room became heavier than any storm. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, as if waiting for me to gloat, to lash out, to humiliate her the way she had tried to humiliate me. But I did nothing of the sort. I simply breathed, steady and calm, because the victory was not in her shame, it was in my son's final act of remembrance, in his refusal to let me be erased. And in that quiet, I understood that dignity is not about what you claim with noise. It is about what you hold with silence, and I carried that silence like a crown. When I finally rose from my chair, the room was still, and though her jewels still clung to her neck, they no longer shone with triumph, they only hung heavy with shame. I walked slowly toward the door, each step carrying not just the weight of years, but the quiet strength of a truth that could never be denied. And I did not need to look back at her to know that the sound of her own silence was louder than any laughter she had ever thrown at me. My son had remembered. He had chosen to honor the love that raised him, and that alone was worth more than any fortune written on paper. I carried that truth with me, not as money in a bank, but as dignity in my heart, and it was all I needed to step into the world with my head held high. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. I'm grateful for your time, and if you found something in my words that touched your heart, please subscribe, share this with others, and join me again for more stories that remind us all that truth, no matter how long it waits, always finds its voice.